Consuelo Mendoza was walked out of her own home on a Tuesday morning with one suitcase and nowhere to go. She had no family she hadn't already given everything to, no savings she hadn't stitched together needle by needle over 30 years, and no plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other on the road toward town. What she didn't know yet was that the road itself was going to decide where she went. Welcome to Stories Between Lives. If this story touches something in you, subscribe to the channel and leave us a comment telling us where you're joining us from tonight. Consuelo was 57 years old, and this was the first morning in her life that she had nowhere to be. She had been 26 when her sister Dolores died. 3 days after giving birth to Ernesto, in the little clinic at the edge of Atotonilco, Jalisco, from a hemorrhage that arrived without warning and left behind nothing but a baby boy and a bassinet that smelled of flannel and talcum powder. The baby's father had been gone for 2 months. There was no other family. Consuelo was at the seamstress shop where she worked when they called, and she arrived in her work apron still holding a spool of thread she hadn't thought to put down. When the nurse brought Ernesto to her, she unwrapped the hospital blanket enough to see his face. She said, "All right. I've got him." She raised him in the family house, solid adobe. 2 rooms, a covered porch, a kitchen that faced the back garden. She kept her job at the shop and took in mending at home in the evenings, working by lamplight after Ernesto was in bed. She never missed a school assembly. She sat in the front row of his first communion and cried, and then went home and made rice and beans and fried plantain for the guests. And no one thanked her, because they had come to expect it. She had expected them to expect it. That was the arrangement she had made with herself, and she had kept it for 31 years. Ernesto was a good man, in the way some people are good without being particularly attentive. He worked construction in Guadalajara, sent money when the work was steady, came home for Christmas and Holy Week. Consuelo had built a life that fit around his absence and didn't ask more than it needed to. Then last spring, he came home with Fernanda. Fernanda Ruiz was 28, from a city family, with the particular confidence of women who have never had to make do with less. Within her first week in the house, she had reorganized the kitchen Consuelo had arranged for 3 decades. Consuelo's mother's embroidered napkins went into a drawer. The jars were relabeled. The sewing basket was moved to the back room without a word. She said what she meant only once, and she said it on a Thursday evening, in the kitchen, in front of Ernesto, who was sitting at the table eating the bread Consuelo had baked that morning. "I honestly don't understand," said Fernanda, not looking at either of them, "why a woman her age hasn't figured out what she's going to do with her life." Ernesto did not look up from his plate. Consuelo turned off the faucet. She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth. She did not respond, because she had learned a long time ago that some silences are not weakness. They are the only answer a person with dignity has left. She packed her things on Friday. On Tuesday, she was out the door before dawn. She left the beans on the stove, and the napkins where Fernanda had put them, and the house swept clean. She took her mother's rebozo, a length of blue wool faded at the edges, from the drawer where she had kept it folded since her mother died, and tucked it at the bottom of her suitcase under her clothes. She picked up the suitcase. She walked out. At the end of the road she stopped and stood with the case at her feet and looked at the hills coming into the gray morning light, and she did not cry, because she had already done that the night before. Alone in the kitchen, she had swept every morning for 31 years, and she had decided that was enough. Don Leandro Vasquez was coming down from the hills in his old pickup when he saw her. He was 63 years old, a widower of 2 years, and he recognized her the way people in small towns recognize each other. Not through closeness, but through shared duration. Through enough funerals and market days and Sunday masses to make a face familiar even when the name takes a moment. He had known her parents. He remembered hearing about Dolores. He pulled over. "Doa Consuelo," he said through the window. She looked at him. "Don Leandro." "Where are you headed?" She looked down the road. "Wherever it goes." He got out and lifted her suitcase into the truck bed without asking. She got in. He drove. They went several kilometers without speaking, the hills pale and wet in the early morning, the mesquite trees along the roadside still dark against a sky that hadn't quite decided on its color yet. He told her about the ranch the way he talked about everything, plainly, without preamble, the way men who have managed land for 40 years talk about practical realities. His wife Carmen had died 2 years ago, and the house had not recovered properly since. He was eating from cans. The kitchen had not really functioned since Carmen left it. His daughter Marcela lived in Aguascalientes and came twice a year. A woman from the town came Thursdays to clean, but it wasn't enough. "I'm not looking for charity," said Consuelo. "Good," said Don Leandro. "Because I'm not offering any. A room, your meals, and a small wage, in exchange for keeping the house properly. If it doesn't suit you, tell me and I'll drive you wherever you want to go." She looked out the window at the hills coming into the light. She thought of the kitchen she had just left. She thought of Ernesto not looking up from his plate. She thought of God, who had put her on a road with a suitcase and no plan, and apparently had a plan of his own. "For now," she said. "I'll try it." The ranch sat at the end of a red dirt road flanked by mesquites. A low stone house with thick adobe walls and a porch that faced east toward the hills. A garden beside the house that had gone to weeds but showed its original shape if you looked at it right. The raised bed outlines still visible. The rose canes along the south wall winter bare, but rooted. The gray crown of a lavender bush buried under dead growth. The gate was solid iron. The roof was sound. Someone had built this place with the intention of staying. Inside it smelled of dust and old cooking oil and the specific stillness of a house that has been maintained but not inhabited. Kept clean, not kept alive. Don Leandro showed her the back room, a window facing east, a wooden bed frame, a wardrobe with one door that didn't close flush, a hook on the wall. Simple and honest. Consuelo set her suitcase on the floor. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the ranch coming through the window. Cattle. Somewhere on the hill. The wind through the mesquite trees. A dog barking in the far distance. She thought that this was the first night in 31 years that no one needed anything from her. What she did not know yet was that this house held something that had been waiting for her for a very long time. In the mornings she was up before Don Leandro. She had the fire going and the coffee on the stove by the time his boots came down the hall. 30 years of early mornings lived in her body without needing to be asked. The first time he came into the kitchen and found the coffee ready, he stopped at the door for a second. He didn't say anything. He poured himself a cup and stood at the window and looked at the hills, and Consuelo went on with what she was doing, and neither of them spoke, and it didn't feel strange. It felt like two people who were used to getting on with things. She organized the kitchen over the first 3 days. Carmen's logic was still visible in the way the shelves were arranged, the hooks near the stove, the labeled tins, and Consuelo followed that logic as she found it. She wasn't trying to replace anything. She was following the map of a woman she had never met, but could already recognize, in the detail of the kitchen, as someone who had known what she was doing. She found the tablecloth on the 4th day. It was folded at the bottom of a cedar chest in the back room, under a winter blanket and 2 sets of white curtains. a white linen tablecloth with a border of embroidered flowers running along every edge, blue and small and finely stitched, the work of someone who had taken enormous care and enormous patience. Consuelo unfolded it on the kitchen table and smoothed it with both hands. It covered the surface exactly. She stood looking at it for a moment, then left it there. Don Leandro came in at noon. He had not eaten a midday meal in the house since Carmen died. He took something cold in the pasture, or went without. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw the tablecloth. He stood there for a moment without moving. "She made that herself," he said, "before we were married." "It's beautiful work," said Consuelo. He sat down. She set rice and beans and grilled meat in front of him and went back to the stove. He ate slowly and fully, the way she would learn he did everything. When he stood to go, he picked up his hat and said, "Thank you." 2 words and nothing more. But they carried something she recognized. After that, he came home for lunch every day. She worked the garden in the late afternoons, in the hour before the light left the hills. She cleared the weeds by hand and broke up the dried crust of soil, and watered the roots she found beneath it without certainty that any of them would come back. It seemed right to try. One evening Don Leandro came and stood at the edge of the cleared bed. "Carmen planted those when we first moved here," he said. "I didn't know they were still in there." "They might come back," said Consuelo. "We'll see." He nodded. That night at the table he told her about Carmen. He said she had been a woman who got up before the sun, who could fix an engine but preferred to embroider, who never raised her voice and never needed to. When he finished, he looked at Consuelo across the table and said, "She would have liked you." Consuelo kept her needle moving. Something in that sentence settled in her chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water. Don Refugio Pacheco, the oldest man in the community and the one everyone went to when something needed to be settled correctly, came by one afternoon on the pretext of a question about a disputed fence line. He stayed for coffee. He watched Consuelo move around the kitchen with the competence of someone who has never doubted her own hands, and when she brought the tray with the small sugar bowl and the folded cloth under the cups, things Don Leandro had not thought to put out in 2 years, Don Refugio raised his eyebrows slightly in Don Leandro's direction. Don Leandro looked at the wall. "She's good people," Don Refugio said quietly at the door when he left. Don Leandro said nothing, which, for him, was the same thing as yes. What Consuelo was about to find, what neither of them could have imagined, was that among Carmen's things in the cedar chest there was a small tin box that was going to change everything she thought she understood about how she had come to be here. She found it because she knocked it over. She was dusting the high shelf in Carmen's room, working slowly and deliberately, leaving everything she wasn't sure about for Marcela's visit, when her elbow caught a tin box wedged behind a stack of folded rebozos. It fell to the floor and rang with a bright, clear sound, like a small bell struck once. Inside were letters, 6 of them, in envelopes of different sizes. 4 were clearly from family. She could tell from the addresses and the handwriting on the outside. 1 was blank, and 1 was in Carmen's own handwriting, careful and deliberate, addressed for Consuelo, from San Marcos, if I ever find her. Consuelo sat on the edge of Carmen's bed and held the envelope for a long time without opening it. She held it the way you hold something when you already sense, without knowing how, that what's inside it is going to matter. Then she opened it. The letter was dated 11 years earlier. It said, "I have been looking for you for almost 20 years, and I don't know if this letter will ever reach you. Your name was Consuelo, and you were from San Marcos in Jalisco. I was 19 years old and alone at the bus station in Guadalajara, All my money spent on a bus ticket that went to the wrong place. The counter closed. I was sitting on a bench trying not to cry when you sat down beside me. You didn't ask what was wrong. You asked if I was hungry, and when I said no out of shame, you went to the cart across the way and came back with a torta. When my bus came, the right one, which you helped me find, you took the rebozo from your own shoulders and put it around mine because you said the mountain passes were cold at night. I tried to give it back, and you wouldn't let me. I have kept it for 20 years. I have thought of you more times than I can count. Leandro says I'm foolish to write to someone I don't know how to reach. But kindness like yours stays in the body and doesn't leave, and you deserve to know that yours didn't. Consuelo put the letter on her knee. She sat for a long moment in the soft afternoon light of Carmen's room, the curtains letting the sun through as a diffuse glow, and she did not move. Then she stood up and went to her own room and opened her suitcase and lifted her clothes aside until she reached the bottom. The rebozo was there as she had packed it. Blue wool, faded at the edges, the fringe repaired in 2 places. The same one she had taken from her own shoulders at a bus station in Guadalajara 30 years ago, when she was 24 and on her way home from a fabric market, and pressed around a frightened girl who had said no and then yes. She had not thought of it as a remarkable thing. She had thought of it as a Tuesday morning and a girl who needed a shawl. She carried the rebozo and the letter back to the kitchen table and laid them beside each other. She sat down. She was sitting that way, very still, when Don Leandro came in from the lower pasture. He read the letter when she pushed it across the table to him. He read it slowly and completely. When he finished, he set it down and looked at the rebozo beside it for a long time. She looked for you for years, he said, every woman she met from that part of Jalisco. I didn't know, said Consuelo. No, a pause. She would have wanted you to know. I know, said Consuelo. I think, somehow she does. The kitchen held a silence that didn't need filling. Outside, the light on the hills was going orange at the rim. Ernesto and Fernanda arrived on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks later. Consuelo saw the rental car through the kitchen window and set down the knife she was using to slice the papaya. She dried her hands on her apron and stood up straight. They came to the gate. Ernesto had the look of a man who has been talked into something he isn't certain of. Fernanda had the look of a woman who has rehearsed. We need your signature on some papers, said Fernanda, before the gate was fully open. About the house. We're going to sell it, and we need the agreement of all co-owners. Good morning, said Consuelo. Fernanda stopped. A flicker of something crossed her face. Ernesto looked at the ground. The house belonged to my parents equally, said Consuelo. My sister's share passed to Ernesto when she died. My share is mine. I haven't agreed to anything. The house needs repairs we can't afford without selling it, said Fernanda. And you're not even living there anymore. You left. I left, said Consuelo, because I was made to feel that I didn't belong in a house I maintained for 31 years. That's not the same as giving it up. Don Leandro had come around from the side of the house. He stood at the edge of the porch with his arms crossed and his hat on, and there was a stillness about him that had nothing to do with uncertainty. This doesn't concern you, said Fernanda. Doa Consuelo is under my roof, said Don Leandro. That makes it my concern. Don Refugio appeared at the gate with the calm inevitability of a man who always seems to be passing by when something needs witnessing. He greeted everyone with equal courtesy and noted pleasantly that property matters really ought to be handled with a notary present on a scheduled day, not at someone's gate on a Saturday. Fernanda looked at the folder in her hands. Then she looked at Ernesto. Ernesto raised his eyes. He looked at his aunt, at her apron, at the steadiness in her hands, at the way she was standing in Don Leandro's doorway with the same composure she had stood in the kitchen doorway every morning of his life. And something moved through his face that was not yet regret, but was the thing that comes immediately before it. "We should do this properly," he said quietly. "Through a notary. Not here. Ernesto, we'll make an appointment." He said it to Fernanda without raising his voice. And then, to Consuelo, meeting her eyes, "I'm sorry, Auntie, for how things went." He wasn't ready for more than that. But he said it, and he meant it, and she could tell the difference between the two. Fernanda said nothing more. They left. Don Refugio stayed for coffee and talked about the fence line again, unhurried, and the day resumed its ordinary rhythm. When they were gone, Don Leandro stood at the porch rail, looking at the hills. "She was wrong," he said. "Yes," said Consuelo. "And he knows it. Yes, he always did." Don Leandro turned and looked at her. A woman who raised someone else's child for 30 years doesn't need anyone's permission to have a place to belong. Consuelo didn't answer. She went back to the kitchen. She finished slicing the papaya and set it in the clay bowl on the embroidered tablecloth and stood at the counter for a moment, with Carmen's letter folded in her apron pocket, where she had taken to keeping it these past weeks, the paper worn soft at the fold. She allowed herself to feel, without ceremony or drama, that she had not been wrong to stay. That summer, the rose canes bloomed. Consuelo found the first open flower on a Wednesday morning in June, small and red and improbable after everything, and stood looking at it for a long time before she went in to tell Don Leandro. He came out and looked at it without speaking. He smiled in the way he smiled, which was mostly in his eyes and briefly, and went back inside. The lavender came up along the south wall in July. The rosemary, it turned out, had never entirely left. By August, the porch in the mornings smelled of all of it together, and Consuelo began taking her coffee outside in the chair that had been Carmen's, watching the hills shift color as the sun came over the mesquites. Don Leandro joined her some mornings, and they talked about small things, the cattle, what Don Refugio had said at the market, whether the east fence needed mending, and some mornings they sat without talking, and that was fine too. The embroidered tablecloth stayed on the kitchen table. On Sundays they ate lunch there, the two of them, and sometimes Don Refugio, and sometimes Marcela, Don Leandro's daughter, who had driven up from Aguascalientes, and who, the first time she came, stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the tablecloth, and said very quietly, "That's my mother's." And Consuelo had said, "I know. It's beautiful work," and Marcela had sat down, and they had eaten together. One evening in September, Don Leandro stayed at the table after supper and poured 2 small glasses of brandy and set one in front of Consuelo. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as an arrangement." Permanently, Consuelo looked at the blue flowered border of the tablecloth, at the small stitches, each one placed with intention, each one the same, and somehow each one its own. "Why?" she asked. He thought about it in the way he thought about everything, without hurrying. "Because this house was quiet in the wrong way for 2 years," he said. "And then you came, and it went quiet, in the right way. I don't want to lose that again." Consuelo held the brandy glass in both hands and didn't answer right away. She thought of Dolores, who never got to see Ernesto walk. She thought of a girl on a bench at a bus station in Guadalajara. A cold morning, a rebozo pressed back and forth between 2 pairs of hands. She thought of Carmen, who had kept a letter for 11 years addressed to someone she couldn't find, and who had, without either of them knowing it, left that letter in a tin box in a cedar chest for the one person it was meant for. She thought that God works in ways that don't make sense until suddenly, one morning, they do. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." Don Leandro raised his glass. She raised hers. There are women who spend their whole lives arranging comfort for others and who tell themselves, over time, that this is enough. And sometimes it is. But sometimes, if God is paying attention, the world arranges something for them in return, not as a reward, not as a miracle, but as something quieter than either. A door at the end of a dirt road that was always going to be open, and a table already set, and a kindness given away on an ordinary morning 30 years ago, waiting patiently to come home. Have you ever given something away, only to have it find its way back to you when you needed it most? If this story touched something in you, leave us your comment below. Tell us where you're joining us from tonight. Subscribe to Stories Between Lives and turn on the bell so no story slips past you. Share this with someone who deserves to be reminded that the life they put on hold for others hasn't forgotten them. Until the next story. A heart-to-heart embrace. Consuelo stayed on the porch after Don Leandro went in, with the brandy glass warming in her hands and the smell of roses and lavender rising from the garden in the dark. Carmen's letter was in her apron pocket, worn soft at the fold from weeks of carrying. She looked out at the hills, black now against a sky full of stars, the same hills Carmen had looked at from this same chair for 30 years. She set her glass down. She smoothed the corner of her rebozo over the chair's armrest. "Thank you," she said, very quietly, to the night, to the woman she had never met, to the God who had apparently been keeping track all along. The night said nothing back. That was enough.